By 1945, the Waffen-SS had metastasized into a sprawling, chaotic web of armed formations. The roster included heavily armored panzer divisions, desperate foreign conscripts, and literal death squads pulled directly from German prisons. In this video, we're ranking these units from bottom to top based strictly on their level of criminality using our atrocity and complicity index. The list starts with D tier, a category reserved for failures, mutineers, and paper divisions that rarely even had weapons. Because they spent most of their time completely disorganized or retreating, units in D tier largely avoided documented systematic atrocity records. Right above them is C tier, holding the highly ideological volunteer legions and battle-hardened frontline divisions. These units operated in brutal theaters where the rules of war completely eroded. They're heavily stained by localized reprisal killings and severe war crimes, but their violence was generally a byproduct of high-intensity conventional combat rather than a dedicated extermination mandate. B tier is where systematic war crimes become a core operational feature rather than a localized exception. These are the units officially complicit in executing prisoners of war and conducting brutal pacification sweeps that purposely wiped out entire civilian villages. At the absolute peak of the pyramid sits A tier. These infamous engines of terror operated as the primary architects of Nazi atrocities. They were responsible for industrial-scale genocide and the murder of hundreds of thousands of civilians. So, with that said, let's start at the bottom of the barrel and work our way up. The SS eventually found itself fighting in every major combat theatre in Europe during the Second World War, and as the conflict dragged on, Allied air superiority became a catalyst for their eventual defeat. Flak batteries were used to try and repel constant aerial bombardments, but reading about anti-aircraft gunners fighting incoming bombers is one thing, but simulating that exact fraction of a second where you have to pull the trigger is entirely different. That brings me to today's sponsor, Medal Hunter. Medal Hunter is a free mobile military PvP game on iOS and Android that completely strips away the handholding. Instead of running around a map with auto-aim doing the work for you, the game sits you behind heavy, stationary weapons in locations grounded in documented history, like Pearl Harbor or Vietnam. It's a one-on-one duel across 3 waves where you and your opponent are competing to hit the most targets across those 3 waves. The gameplay shifts across naval, aerial, and ground battlefields, allowing you to master 3 distinct shooting modes. Whether you're tracking targets with anti-air flak, dialing in artillery arcs, or relying on sniper precision, you only win the match if your timing is genuinely better than the person you're matched against. Right now, Medal Hunter is hosting one to reward the community, dropping a prize pool of over $30,000 in Bass Pro gift cards. Everyone who enters is guaranteed to win something, and you get a shot at a $500 jackpot. Getting a prize is incredibly simple. Just download the game and play until you reach Arena 2 to unlock your first spin on the prize wheel, with 3 more unlocked as you pass Arenas 4, 7, and 9. To use those spins, copy your player ID, go to the mh-challenge.com and spin the wheel to see what you get. This is open to US residents only, excluding New York, Rhode Island, Hawaii, and Florida, and closes on September 13th. Download Medal Hunter now and tell me in the comments what you've won. Now, let's get back to the history. British Free Corps. The British Free Corps is one of the most bizarre footnotes of the war. Conceived by British fascist John Amory to fight Bolshevism, the SS headhunted recruits from German POW camps using basic bribes like cigarettes and alcohol. Despite massive propaganda efforts, the unit never exceeded 27 active members at any one time. Their only official deployment came in March 1945, attached to the 11th SS Division Nordland, where they were shuffled harmlessly behind the lines. Most were simply opportunists wanting to escape the POW life, and their most notable wartime activity was arguing over their unit's flag design. Amory was executed for treason in 1945, while surviving members faced court-martials. This was a pathetic propaganda experiment rather than a functional criminal unit, landing it squarely at the very bottom of D tier. Free Arabian Legion. Forged in 1941 from the wreckage of the Anglo-Iraqi War, The Free Arabian Legion sought to weaponize anti-colonialism against the British and French. Spearheaded by the exiled Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the alliance was built on mutual suspicion. While Arab volunteers hoped for independent states, German leadership secretly planned to retain colonial control. Consequently, the SS never fully trusted the formation, sidelining volunteers into labor roles and keeping heavy weapons exclusively manned by Germans. The Legion saw limited action fighting local partisans in Greece and Yugoslavia, but their lack of motorized equipment and a rigid internal hierarchy prevented them from evolving into a cohesive military force. As a failed experiment in political opportunism that lacked the systematic massacre records defining the higher tiers, we rank the Free Arabian Legion as a firmly neutral D tier. Waffen-Grenadier Regiment of the SS, 1st Bulgarian. When Bulgaria suddenly defected to the Allies in late 1944, Hitler scrambled to maintain the illusion of an alliance. He drafted pro-German Bulgarian soldiers and students stranded in German territory to create this makeshift regiment. Their primary military contribution was acting as a protective rearguard during the massive retreat through the Vardar Valley. Plagued by abysmal morale and crippling supply shortages, the unit's hunger became so severe that soldiers halted training just to plant potatoes to survive. This total lack of purpose triggered a massive desertion attempt and a tragic fratricidal firefight between the starving volunteers and their commanders. Spending your deployment planting potatoes instead of conducting standard SS operation easily earns a spot in D tier. 23rd Waffen Mountain Division of the SS, Kama, 2nd Croatian. The Kama Division was a delusional administrative fantasy. Envisioned as a part of a grand, completely unrealistic plan to create a 5-division Balkan SS army, this 2nd Bosnian Muslim unit never came close to reaching its authorized strength. In October 1944, a few barely trained elements were thrown into a frantic delay action along the Tisa River to slow the Soviet Red Army. Before training was even finished, rumors spread that the Germans were preparing to abandon the Balkans, leaving the Bosnian soldiers to their fate. This sparked a violent mutiny, effectively ending the division's existence before it could truly begin. A short-lived, mutinous failure like Kama belongs nowhere else but D tier. 37th SS Volunteer Cavalry Division, Lützow. Born from the wreckage of the 8th and 22nd Cavalry Divisions following their annihilation at Budapest, the Lützow Division was a true Frankenstein formation. German planners hastily fleshed out these veteran remnants with underage Hungarian recruits in early 1945, creating a unit that was more a collection of displaced survivors. Chronically under strength and lacking horses, Lützow managed to serve as a mobile rearguard for the 6th Panzer Army. Its only notable achievement was surviving the final high-stakes retreat into Austria. Their entire operational focus was maintaining enough discipline to surrender to the Americans rather than being destroyed by the Soviets. 3 chaotic months defined entirely by frantic survival places Lützow in our neutral D tier. 38th SS Division, Nibelungen. Holding the unique distinction of being the final division officially designated by the Waffen-SS, the Nibelungen entered the fray in March 1945. Unlike the chaotic penal and conscript units of the late war, its core cadre came directly from the prestigious SS Junkerschule at Bad Tölz. These were indoctrinated officer cadets, the elite future leaders of the SS, suddenly thrust into frontline combat roles as the Reich collapsed around them. Despite having zero time for actual divisional training, this roughly 6,000 strong unit offered fierce, highly competent resistance on the Danube front. Led by these officer cadets, they served as a formidable defensive roadblock against the American advance through Bavaria, displaying a level of tactical cohesion exceptionally rare for the war's final weeks. A purely conventional defensive war with a lifespan of barely 30 days and 0 documented massacres puts the 38th into D tier. 17th Waffenkorps of the SS, Hungarian. Born from the chaos of a late 1944 German-led coup in Budapest, this corps was an improvised attempt to weaponize Hungarian manpower. By rolling the 25th, 26th, and 33rd Divisions into a unified command, Berlin planners hoped to conjure a massive defensive pillar to stabilize the crumbling Eastern Front. The reality was much bleaker. These soldiers lacked uniforms, basic ammunition, and vehicles. To make matters worse, the German command offered so little support that the 9th Army actually confiscated the Corps' few heavy weapons to shore up their own lines. Left completely unarmed and forced to scavenge for food, the soldiers simply didn't stand and fight. Complete organizational failure and continuous retreat define this paper formation, dropping the 17th Waffen Corps straight into D tier. Norwegian Legion. Marketed in 1941 by Vidkun Quisling as a patriotic crusade to assist Finland, over 1,900 volunteers joined the Norwegian Legion under the promise of wearing Norwegian uniforms and fighting a localized war. Instead, the Germans deceived them, diverting their unit deep into the Soviet interior to suppress Norwegian territorial ambitions in the Arctic. Their high watermark occurred during the brutal winter of 1942 at Krasnoye Selo. Occupying the siege lines around Leningrad, the Legion maintained defensive integrity under constant Soviet shelling and sniper fire. However, once the volunteers realized they were being used as a standard SS infantry in Russia rather than liberators of Finland, recruitment plummeted and morale completely shattered. This internal friction between Quisling's political goals and German military reality led to the unit's early dissolution by early 1943. Restricted entirely to static trench warfare and disbanded before the late war atrocities escalated, the Norwegian Legion sits in D tier. 22nd SS Volunteer Cavalry Division, Maria Theresia. The product of a crumbling Reich tapping into the ethnic German populations of Hungary, Maria Theresia was authorized in early 1944. Built around a veteran cadre from the infamous 8th SS Florian Geyer, the division swelled to over 12,000 men. The unit saw early action supporting Otto Skorzeny in a lightning-fast coup that stormed Buda Castle and effectively hijacked the Hungarian government. However, their primary combat test came during the siege of Budapest in late 1944. Pulled into the city's defensive ring just as the Soviet encirclement closed, the unit was slowly ground to dust under Soviet armor and brutal urban attrition, with only a tiny fraction of its men managing a successful breakout. Despite its veteran core coming from a highly criminal parent unit, which we'll discuss later, this specific division fought a strictly conventional urban defense. Annihilated in traditional combat, Maria Theresia remains safely in D tier. 32nd SS Volunteer Grenadier Division, 30 Januar. Named after the date Hitler ascended to the Chancellorship, the 32nd SS was an improvised German effort in January 1945. It was cobbled together from SS school staff, trainees, and fleeing Romanian and Hungarian fascists. Reaching a formidable paper strength of 12,000 men, it was deployed to the Oder front, where it served as a primary defensive pillar north of Berlin. In an operating environment of total collapse, it managed to maintain enough cohesion to act as a temporary obstacle to the Soviet advance during the war's final hours. However, the unit was quickly caught in the attritional nightmare of the Halbe Pocket, a site of absolute carnage where the German 9th Army was effectively destroyed. Most of the division was annihilated in frantic breakout attempts, with only fragments reaching American lines. A brief lifespan devoid of a massive atrocity record keeps this final gasp of the SS system firmly in D tier. 29th Waffengrenadier Division, Italische No. 1. Following the collapse of the Italian fascist state in late 1944, the 29th emerged as the primary Italian SS division. Gathering those still loyal to Mussolini and the Axis cause, it represented the fading heartbeat of Italian-German military cooperation. With roughly 11,000 men, the division served in frontline and security roles across the collapsing Italian and Central European theaters. Caught squarely in the middle of a brutal civil and international war, this impossible strategic position resulted in a total collapse of operational cohesion as the theater descended into a state of disorganized retreat. Despite operating in a region known for vicious reprisal killings, the 29th lacks sufficient documented unit-level atrocity linkage in the consulted records. A fragmented symbol of a collapsing regime rather than a coordinated engine of terror, the Italian SS lands in D tier. 31st Waffen-Grenadier Division, Bachka. Rising from the ashes of the failed Kammer Division in October 1944, the 31st was fueled by a final recruitment drive of ethnic Germans from the Bachka region of Hungary. Their combat apex came during the high-stakes defense of the Danube bridgeheads. Thrown into the line to blunt the Soviet offensives, they briefly functioned as a critical defensive anchor in southern Hungary. However, the 11,000-strong unit suffered from a total collapse of supply. After an Allied air raid destroyed a vital clothing train, soldiers were seen fighting in the Silesian winter wearing civilian slippers or oversized overcoats. Earning the derisive nickname the Sleeping Cap Division, their strength rapidly eroded. Encircled and destroyed in Czechoslovakia by May 1945, this battle-tested but critically unsupplied buffer unit earns its place in D tier. 35th SS Polizei Grenadier Division. In the chaotic spring of 1945, the Germans recycled specialized SS police units into a final combat formation to plug widening gaps protecting the heart of the Reich. As a component of the German 9th Army, the 35th had an immediate commitment to the defense of Berlin, standing as a wall on the approaches to the capital to hold back the overwhelming Soviet juggernaut. Thrown straight into the cauldron of the battle over the Zilov Heights, the division was badly mauled before it could ever find its tactical footing. It was eventually caught in the Battle of Halba, a pocket of total destruction where organized resistance dissolved into a broken retreat. Despite its dark roots in Nazi Germany's police structures, the 35th's legacy is ultimately that of a short-lived combat stopgap. Without a sustained unit-level atrocity record, it comfortably lands in D tier. Waffen-Grenadier Regiment of the SS, 1st Romanian. Built from captured soldiers of the Romanian 4th Infantry Division, this regiment also became a lifeboat for members of the Iron Guard, the Romanian fascist movement that maintained a dark ideological kinship with the SS. The unit was posted to the River Oder front and essentially thrown into the line to slow the Soviet steamroller as a foreign-born shield for the dying Reich. While the Germans intended to expand this into a full division, the reality was pathetic. By April 1945, there was no fuel, food, or ammunition, and the men who were supposed to be elite grenadiers were instead relegated to construction battalions, digging trenches with shovels because they weren't even trusted with rifles. Without weapons, fuel, or purpose, they were essentially a penal construction crew and an easy D tier. 6th SS Volunteer Corps, Latvian. Forged from a massive wave of illegal, compulsory conscription by the German occupation, this corps, made up of the 15th and 19th Divisions, took shape between 1943 and 1944. Latvian citizens were drafted under the guise of labor decrees, and for the recruits, this was a pragmatic attempt to form a national shield against a second Soviet occupation of their homeland. The Corps demonstrated fierce defensive resilience, holding out in the Courland pocket long after the rest of the front had shattered. Geographic isolation and a failing supply network eventually broke the Corps, forcing a mass Soviet surrender in Courland while depleted fragments fled toward American lines. Uniquely, this Corps has been historically exonerated. Post-war Western authorities recognized the Latvian Legion as distinct from the criminal SS. Motivated by homeland defense without documented unit-level war crimes, they securely hold a D-tier ranking. 20th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Estonian. Following an urgent radio plea from their Prime Minister, over 38,000 men registered to forge this division from the existing Estonian Legion in early 1944. They viewed the unit as a national shield against a returning Soviet occupation, just like the Latvians. Their operational height came during the Battle of the Tannenberg Line in July 1944, where they stubbornly held a defensive position against a massive Red Army onslaught. However, their identity was tied strictly to Estonian soil, and once the German withdrawal forced them to abandon their homeland, morale and cohesion completely fractured, and the remnants were ground down in Silesia. The 20th SS, like their Latvian brothers, has a rare legacy of rehabilitation. Recognized by the Allies as conscripts defending their independence rather than ideological criminals, survivors were even utilized to guard Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. Lacking atrocity records, they stand as the final unit in D tier. 34th SS Volunteer Grenadier Division, Landstrom Nederland. Moving into the C tier, we start with the Landstrom Nederland. Originally established as an auxiliary police force in early 1943, this unit was the Reich's answer to the growing Dutch resistance. It tapped into local collaborationist manpower by promising volunteers they would only serve within the Netherlands. This home defense guarantee made it highly attractive to local fascists. The division's most famous moment came during Operation Market Garden in September 1944. Thrown into the fire at Arnhem, these volunteers proved they could transition from policing civilians to engaging elite Allied paratroopers. Despite this, by 1945, the unit had become a complete administrative anachronism. Relying on hundreds of horses for transport while facing fully mechanized Allied forces. Remembered mostly for its final skirmishes with the Dutch resistance, its roots as an auxiliary police force elevate its potential for massacres. But without the massive documented atrocity records of the higher tiers, it sits comfortably at the bottom of C tier. 27th SS Volunteer Grenadier Division, Langemarck, 1st Flemish. The brainchild of the Flemish National League in mid-1941, the Flemish Legion was originally envisaged as the vanguard of a future independent army. It drew volunteers who viewed the crusade against Bolshevism as a path to national liberation. Despite promises of autonomy, the unit was forcefully absorbed into the SS command structure. The division's combat apex occurred during the defensive battles at the Tannenberg Line in 1994. Tasked with defending the strategic orphanage hill at Narva, the Flemings engaged in some of the most ferocious close-quarters combat of the war, earning a reputation for tenacity. However, institutional friction constantly undermined them, and deep tension between Flemish nationalism and pan-Germanic SS ideology led to frequent mutinies, keeping the unit at perpetual brigade strength due to purges and staggering casualties. Stained by its service to a genocidal regime but primarily engaged in high-intensity conventional combat without systemic massacres, the Langemarck secures C tier. 23rd SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division, Nederland, 1st Dutch. Serving as the flagship project for Dutch collaboration, the Nederland emerged in 1941. Unlike the localized Landstrom, this was a motorized force intended for the high-stakes attrition of the Eastern Front, drawing heavily from the Dutch Nazi Party. In the frozen trenches of Estonia during the battle for the Narva bridgehead in 1944, they proved to be a tenacious defensive formation, holding the line against overwhelming Soviet odds. However, their back was broken during the withdrawal to the Tannenberg Line, when the division was caught in the open and virtually destroyed from the air. By 1945, the Germans could only scrape together a few thousand men who were eventually annihilated in the Halbe pocket. The legacy of the Nederland is a stark reminder that military skill doesn't equate to a clean record. Stained by documented reprisal executions of civilians in the Courland pocket, the unit earns its high-risk ranking in C tier. 28th SS Volunteer Grenadier Division, Wallonien. Beginning as a political gambit by fascist leader Leon de Grelle, the Wallonien was raised to prove his loyalty to the Germans through a unit of French-speaking Belgians. Initially shoved into the regular army, they were absorbed into the Waffen-SS once Himmler declared them a Germanic race. Their operational height came during the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket in February 1944. Trapped in a freezing cauldron, the brigade fought with suicidal tenacity to facilitate a breakout, suffering a staggering 70% casualty rate. This resilience turned them into the poster boys for European collaboration. However, frantic recruitment drives completely hollowed out their party back home, leaving the division a shell of its former self by 1945. The legacy of the Wallonien is a grim mixture of military achievement and documented war crimes, including early participation in civilian executions in the East. A highly ideological, veteran formation deeply committed to the Nazi cause, they land firmly in C tier. Finnish Volunteer Battalion of the Waffen-SS. Driven by the desire to reclaim territory lost to the Soviet Union, the Finnish Volunteer Battalion took shape in 1941. The ideological core was hardline, with nearly half of the recruits belonging to fascist groups. They operated as motorized infantry, capturing the strategic Malgobek Ridge during the 1942 drive into the Caucasus. The unit's existence was governed by a strict 2-year service contract. By mid-1943, the Finnish government refused to renew the agreement, forcing the unit's dissolution at its combat peak. For decades, Finnish historiography sanitized the unit as an apolitical elite force. However, a landmark 2019 report concluded that volunteers were likely involved in atrocities against Jews and civilians while attached to the Viking division. These men were volunteers for an ideological crusade operating in brutal theaters, firmly anchoring them in C tier. 30th Waffen-Grenadier Division Russische No. 2. Assembled at the height of the Soviet advance in 1944, the 30th was an improvised collection of Belarusian and Russian personnel absorbed from auxiliary police units. Many of these men had already participated in brutal security operations in the East before being sent to secure the Belfort Gap in France. While they earned rare praise for destroying several French tanks in November 1944, the unit was plagued by a complete lack of ideological loyalty. This instability culminated in one of the largest mutinies in SS history, where over 800 men killed their German officers and defected to the French resistance. The Germans eventually disarmed thousands more deemed unreliable, effectively gutting the division. Born from collaborationist police units, but largely disintegrated through mutiny, the 30th sits in C tier as a high-risk but unstable formation. 33rd Waffen-Grenadier Division Charlemagne, 1st French. Merging various volunteer groups with the milice, the paramilitary enforcers of Vichy France, the Charlemagne stood as the ultimate project for French collaboration. These men had nowhere to go but the front, knowing they faced treason trials at home. The division authored one of the darkest chapters of the Battle of Berlin, where a small assault battalion became legendary tank hunters around the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. Armed with Panzerfausts, they were among the very last defenders of the central government district. Despite their fanatical performance in Berlin, the division was almost entirely destroyed in Pomerania just weeks earlier. Their background in the milice and their history of bandit fighting in the East ensures they're never viewed as clean combatants. Military tenacity combined with ideological extremism lands the Charlemagne in C tier. 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg. Filled primarily by conscripted German teenagers drafted into the SS against their preference, the Frundsberg materialized in early 1943. The division's most notable engagement occurred during Operation Market Garden, where they were instrumental in the defense of the Nijmegen Bridge. Their ability to rapidly mobilize against Allied paratroopers prevented a decisive breakthrough, proving their effectiveness as a mobile armored reserve. However, the unit was caught in a constant cycle of near annihilation and rebuilding. This division is often remembered for its notable personnel, specifically Nobel laureate Günter Grass, whose late-life revelation of service sparked international debate. As a combat-hardened formation of conscripts caught in the gears of total war, the Frundsberg slots into C tier. 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen. Designed as a heavy armored reserve, the Hohenstaufen was raised in France using a cadre of veterans to train a massive influx of young German conscripts. Its combat apex was the Battle of Arnhem, where they successfully contained the British 1st Airborne Division and spearheaded the destruction of the reconnaissance battalion on the Arnhem Bridge. The division served as a fire brigade, thrown into every major crisis from the Eastern Front to the Ardennes, suffering systematic attrition that eventually crippled its mobility. Unlike the depraved units at the top of our list, the Hohenstaufen is noted for its professional conduct in several engagements, with commanders occasionally observing traditional laws of war regarding wounded enemies. Operating as a high-tier, conventional armored formation without a record of systematic massacres places the Hohenstaufen in C tier. 6th SS Mountain Division, Nord. Starting out as a haphazard collection of concentration camp guards, Nord initially fled in panic during its first encounter with the Red Army. However, the unit underwent a radical transformation to become the only SS division specialized for Arctic warfare. They mastered the brutal Karelian environment and executed a legendary 1,600-kilometer fighting withdrawal through sub-zero temperatures when Finland exited the war. Their transition to the Western Front in 1945 exposed their fragility as they were bled white in the Vosges Mountains without heavy support. Nord occupies a unique space as the Arctic Division, but its legacy is inextricably tied to its Totenkopf pedigree. While they evolved into a competent military formation, their roots in the camp system made them an essential part of the SS ideological vanguard, securing a C tier. 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division, Nordland. Marketed to weaponize Scandinavian collaboration, Nordland was assembled in 1943 as a Germanic volunteer unit, though nearly 80% of its ranks were eventually filled by ethnic Germans. The division reached its combat apex at the Tannenberg Line in 1944, absorbing massive Soviet artillery barrages to hold the line in Estonia. As the front collapsed, the depleted division was forced into a frantic defense of the central government district in Berlin, with its headquarters reduced to a single U-Bahn carriage. While often discussed as a pan-European volunteer force, its record is not clean. The division is documented for burning and looting multiple Serb villages in Croatia during its early deployment. While it lacks the industrial-scale infamy of the top tier, its status as a fanatical ideological vanguard and its involvement in reprisal actions place Nordland in C tier. Serbian Volunteer Corps. Operating as the paramilitary wing of a local fascist movement, the SDK was utilized by puppet governments to crush partisan rebels starting in late 1941. They were ideologically unique, pledging loyalty to the Serbian king while serving under tactical SS command. The unit reached its high watermark during intensive counterinsurgency operations, using localized intelligence to disrupt partisan networks more effectively than standard German troops. However, they were fundamentally unsuitable for conventional warfare. When the Red Army arrived in 1944, the SDK's light infantry structure completely shattered. The unit is defined by a tragic end and deep-seated local infamy, with thousands of its men executed post-war in the Kochevsky Rog massacre. A fanatical fascist paramilitary responsible for summary executions and mass hangings across Serbia, the SDK represents a high-risk C-tier formation. 18th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division, Horst Wessel. Built on a foundation of experienced Eastern Front personnel and Hungarian recruits, the Horst Wessel was raised in 1944 using a veteran cadre of security troops. Named after a Nazi martyr, the unit's most significant impact was the suppression of the Slovak national uprising. They crushed internal resistance through high-intensity urban combat and brutal reprisal actions against the civilian population. As an emergency formation, the division was frequently fragmented to plug holes in the line, preventing it from ever operating as a cohesive military force. However, its heavy involvement in rear security and its roots in the notorious 1st SS Infantry Brigade link it directly to systemic war crimes. This history of predatory internal pacification officially starts our list of B-tier units. 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Götz von Berlichingen. A patchwork of German and foreign volunteers, this division was gathered in France in late 1943. While they offered a stubborn defense in the Normandy blockade that significantly slowed the Allied breakout, their record is defined by a consistent disregard for the laws of war. During the war's closing days, the unit was responsible for a trail of final phase crimes, including the murder of defeatist mayors and exhausted concentration camp prisoners. They remain most famous for the Battle of Castle Itter, where they were defeated by a unique coalition of American GIs and anti-Nazi Wehrmacht soldiers. Documented executions of paratroopers at Grenje and predatory behavior during the retreat locked them firmly into B tier. 14th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Galician. Viewing the unit as a vehicle for future independence against the Soviet Union, over 80,000 volunteers flocked to the 1st Galician. Their primary military commitment was the Battle of Brody, where they served as a doomed rearguard before being shattered within a week. While some honor them as freedom fighters, historians have documented their heavy involvement in systemic atrocities. Specific subunits were directly responsible for the Huta Pienieczka massacre, where up to 1,000 civilians were murdered. Their service in pacification operations across Poland and Slovakia makes their nationalist defense inseparable from Nazi war crimes. Active participation in regional terror campaigns makes the 1st Galician a definitive B-tier entry. 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. A disturbing experiment in indoctrination, this division filled its rank and file with 16 and 17-year-old members of the Hitler Youth. Led by veterans from the Leibstandarte, these teenagers fought with a ferocity that shocked Allied units during the Battle of Caen. However, this fanaticism was inseparable from their criminality. The division is synonymous with the Arden Abbey massacre, where 20 Canadian prisoners were executed, along with a trail of blood through French villages during their retreat. Specifically engineered to be a combat force that institutionalized a culture of no quarter and systematic execution of POWs, the Hitlerjugend is ranked in B tier. A 13th Waffen Mountain Division of the SS Hanscha, 1st Croatian. Designed to crush the Yugoslav partisan movement, Hanscha was an attempt to forge a Bosnian Muslim unit in 1943. They became a specialized instrument of counterinsurgency, clearing partisan bases with high efficiency in the rugged Majevica mountains. However, their legacy is one of charred villages and mass graves across the security zone. The division is responsible for the murder of an estimated 5,000 people, including the horrific massacres of Serb civilians in Bosut and Sremska Racha. Their specific targeting of Jewish and Orthodox populations for liquidation cements their status as a criminal engine of terror. For this systematic savagery, the Hanscha sits deep in B tier. 4th SS Polizei Panzergrenadier Division. Serving as a loophole to bypass recruitment caps, the division was drawn entirely from municipal policemen. They initially operated as horse-drawn infantry before evolving into a Panzergrenadier division on the Eastern Front. While they proved their grit in the frozen swamps of the Volkhov River, the unit's legacy was defined by its transition from soldiers to executioners. During their 1944 deployment in Greece, their focus shifted entirely to pacification. They're responsible for the Distomo massacre, where they slaughtered 214 Greek civilians in a single afternoon, beheading priests and bayoneting infants in their cribs. Any unit that treats the slaughter of hundreds of unarmed women and children as a standard retaliatory procedure earns its place at the highest level of B-tier infamy. Azerbaijani SS volunteer formations. Recruited largely from POWs seeking to escape from the gulags, these units were consolidated into a Turkic Muslim force intended to represent the Reich's interests in the East. Their involvement was most prominent during the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944, where they participated in house-to-house cleansing operations alongside a notorious brigade we have yet to mention. The unit is remembered for its role in the Wola massacre, one of the largest single-event atrocities in European history. While many recruits were motivated by anti-Soviet sentiment, their record is defined by participation in the most depraved actions of the war. Integration into systemic executions ranks them as a primary B-tier war criminal unit. 15th SS Cossack Cavalry Corps. Forged from Cossack volunteers and Soviet POWs who viewed the Reich as a vehicle for a free Russia, This unit transitioned from Wehrmacht regiments into a unified SS corps in late 1944. They functioned as a highly mobile raiding force in the rugged Balkans, using horse-mounted maneuverability to disrupt partisan networks in ways that mechanized units could not. However, the unit was defined by a total lack of institutional discipline and a bandit mentality. Their inability to distinguish between combatants and civilians turned the local population against them, resulting in widespread rape, plundering, and mass hangings of civilians along railroad tracks. The atrocities were so severe that even the puppet Croatian government filed formal complaints with Hitler regarding their behavior. While their story ends with the tragic betrayal of Lienz, their record of regional brutality keeps them firmly in B tier. 21st Waffen Mountain Division of the SS Skanderberg. Tapping directly into the volatile ethnic tensions of Kosovo, this unit was built around a nucleus of Albanian volunteers in May 1944. They were motivated more by local blood feuds and regional revenge than Berlin's ideology. The division's only real efficiency was found in terror. Their most noted action was the arrest of 281 Jews in Pristina for deportation to Bergen-Belsen. Militarily, the unit was a total failure, suffering mass desertions and earning the absolute contempt of German commanders who labeled them untrainable for conventional warfare. However, they were highly effective at the ethnic cleansing of Serb and Orthodox populations, including the massacre of 550 villagers at Velika. Defined almost entirely by participation in the Holocaust and local massacres, Skanderberg closes out our B tier. Breton SS Armed Formation. The Bezen-Perrot marks our official entry into A tier. While tiny in size, peaking at just 80 members, this unit operated with a concentrated, localized depravity that mirrors the most infamous divisions. As a direct extension of the SD, they specialized in the hunt, using their intimate local knowledge and the Breton language to infiltrate resistance networks. They conducted door-to-door executions in the arrest of local Jews. From the slaughter of 31 people in Locminé to 57 partisans in Saint-Hilaire, their conduct was characterized by a distinct neighbor-against-neighbor brutality. Operating as a dedicated engine of the Gestapo's terror apparatus secures this small but lethal formation spot in A tier. 5th SS Panzer Division Viking. Functioning as the centerpiece of Himmler's pan-European project, the Viking combined a German corps with Nordic volunteers from the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. While it was one of the most elite armored formations on the Eastern Front, its military record is inseparable from its criminal one. The division participated in the Holocaust by bullets in Ukraine and engaged in the mass murder of thousands of Jews at Majdanek. Their consistent involvement in atrocities, from burning civilians alive in churches to participating in the final death marches of 1945, marks them as a primary instrument of Nazi genocide. A mobile execution squad that used its elite status to facilitate industrial-scale slaughter, Viking earns its place in A tier. 24th Waffen Mountain Division of the SS, Kastjäger. Specifically engineered for cast hunting, this unit's mission was the brutal suppression of partisans in the jagged limestone caves where Italy, Austria, and Yugoslavia met. Though it never exceeded 3,000 men, its criminal output was staggering. The division's legacy is written in ashes and mass graves, most notably the Avasinis massacre, where 51 civilians were murdered just days before the war ended. A joint study eventually linked this small unit to 23 separate war crimes and the deaths of 277 documented victims. From burning villages to the cold-blooded execution of hostages, the Kastjäger operated as a localized engine of terror in the Alpine borderlands. A specialized mandate for security warfare makes them a definitive A-tier entry. 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division, Prinz Eugen. Serving as the definitive face of SS terror in the Balkans, the Prinz Eugen operated as a mobile instrument of mass terror across Serbia, Bosnia, and Montenegro. Trained as specialized mountain infantry, Their record of documented atrocities is near unrivaled in its theatre of operations, including burning 120 people alive in a church at Kriva Reka and the massacre of over 1,500 civilians near Split. The unit's operational focus was the systematic liquidation of Jewish and Orthodox populations, and it left behind thousands of burned homes and mass graves, with their path of scorched earth cementing their status in A tier. 8th SS Cavalry Division Florian-Geier. Forged from the SS Cavalry Brigade in 1942, the Florian-Geier spent years prioritizing pacification and ethnic cleansing over conventional combat. While they eventually fought in high-intensity urban battles like the Siege of Budapest, this unit was responsible for the slaughter of tens of thousands of civilians in the Soviet Union long before that. Their record, killing 3,000 Russians while recovering only a few hundred weapons and participating in the suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, marks them as a primary engine of the Holocaust. Specializing in the murder of the unarmed, they treated security sweeps as a mechanical process of liquidation. This institutionalized depravity locks them deep in A tier. 29th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Russian, Rona. Beginning as a small militia in the Lokot autonomy, Rona grew into the personal project of Bronislaw Kaminsky. It functioned as a sovereign security army granted local self-governance in exchange for the ruthless suppression of regional resistance. By 1944, the unit swelled to 10,000 men with their own fleet of captured Soviet tanks, but they possessed almost no military discipline. During the Warsaw Uprising, they abandoned tactical objectives to engage in a frenzy of mass looting, rape, and drunkenness. Rona is synonymous with the horrific Ochota massacre, where thousands of civilians were murdered in cold blood. Their depravity reached such a level that it reportedly unsettled the German High Command, eventually leading to Kaminsky's execution by his own allies. With over 10,000 civilian deaths attributed to them, Rona remains a chilling symbol of collaborationist brutality. 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division Reichsführer SS. Built entirely from Heinrich Himmler's personal escort battalion, this unit was designed from day one to be a mobile instrument of Nazi ideology. It consisted of veterans from the concentration camp guard service, ensuring the division operated with a specific, ingrained brutality from its inception. While they fought on the Gothic line, their efficiency was most visible in specialized anti-partisan sweeps in the Italian mountains. The division was the architect of the Marzabotto massacre, the worst mass killing of civilians in Western Europe, where over 770 victims were systematically liquidated. Combined with the horrors at Sant'Anna di Stazzema, their legacy is one of the most documented and repulsive in the history of the Waffen-SS. Treating civilian populations as targets for industrial-scale execution places them firmly in the top 5. 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. Serving as the prototype for the Waffen-SS mechanized elite, Das Reich spearheaded the drive toward Moscow and fought in the massive armored duels at Kursk. However, their military skill was inseparable from an ingrained savagery. During their 1944 march to Normandy, the unit prioritized breaking the spirit of the French population over reaching the beachhead. This resulted in the horrific destruction of Oradour-sur-Glane, where 642 civilians, including women and children, were locked in a church and burned alive or shot. Today, the ruins of Oradour remain untouched as a permanent memorial to the crimes. Functioning as a primary instrument of state terror, Das Reich proves that even the most elite combat units were, at their core, vehicles of mass murder. 1st SS Panzerdivision Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. Originating from Hitler's personal 117-man bodyguard, the Leibstandarte stood as the foundational pillar of the Waffen-SS. Under Sepp Dietrich, it evolved into a premier armored division that served as the ideological vanguard of the Nazi state. Their combat height during the recapture of Kharkov was inseparable from the execution of hundreds of wounded Soviet soldiers in the city's military hospital. The division is defined by a trail of blood across Europe, from the murder of 80 POWs at Wormhout to the machine gunning of 84 American GIs during the Malmedy massacre, establishing them as one of the most infamous formations in history. 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf. Forged by Theodor Eicke directly from the literal guards of the concentration camps, the Totenkopf division operated with a sadistic mindset, treating both prisoners of war and civilians with the mechanical cruelty they'd practiced behind barbed wire. Known for a fanatical, almost suicidal style of aggression on the Eastern Front, they were equally famous for racially motivated murder and institutionalized terror. The division is defined by the Le Paradis massacre, where they machine-gunned 97 British soldiers who had already surrendered. Their legacy is a unit that successfully transitioned the horrors of the camp system onto the battlefield. 36th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division of the SS, Dirlewanger. A twisted social experiment, the Dirlewanger Brigade was composed entirely of the Reich's own predators, including convicted murderers, rapists, and the criminally insane. Under the command of the sadistic Oskar Dirlewanger, these men were granted a license for total depravity that even other SS units found revolting. Their hallmark was the barn, herding hundreds of women and children into wooden structures and setting them on fire, shooting anyone who tried to escape the flames. During the Warsaw Uprising, they performed mock cesarean sections on pregnant women and bayoneted babies to hospital walls. Reveling in a medieval level of cruelty, they murdered an estimated 120,000 people. The Dirlewanger Brigade represents the absolute peak of degeneracy on our list, a unit that proved that when a state weaponizes its worst criminals, the result is a meat grinder of human existence. Looking at this list, the history of the Waffen-SS reveals a map of how a state can systematically dismantle human morality. From the disorganized conscripts in D-tier who were caught in a war they didn't choose, to the literal predators of the Dirlewanger Brigade at the very top, this hierarchy shows the terrifying spectrum of collaboration and criminality. The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane and the mass civilian graves of the Vola massacre are the direct results of an ideology that viewed industrial-scale murder as a legitimate military objective. Ranking these units isn't about celebrating their combat records, but rather about documenting the cost of that ideology. By 1945, the Waffen-SS had proven that when you weaponize hate and grant it the machinery of a modern army, the result is a level of depravity that history will never forget. So, which of these units had the most surprising history to you? Does the military reputation of units like Das Reich or Leibstandarte overshadow their criminal records today? Or is their legacy permanently defined by their atrocities? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.